Hey folks, welcome to Brews and Bytes. I am Kyle Gilliland. Today we're going to talk about, as per the usual, things that I find interesting. So hopefully you enjoy them as well. On the brews side of the house, we're going to talk about this guy right here. This is the New Belgian style ale. It's a triple, which is something that I enjoy. I think I mentioned that on the last episode. Uh, should be similar to the Leffe Blonde, but we'll see. That Leffe was really solid, very creamy, vanilla scent, all of that. It was great. So we'll see how that is. On the Bytes side of the house, we'll talk about none other than SEC rules changes. I know it's exciting stuff, edge of your seat type things. But I'm going to talk to you about two things that I've been talking about really almost for a year or more, and they've come up pretty recently as well, in a couple of different conversations. We're going to talk about the 10K filing requirements and the 8K filing requirements. So we've now had acronyms and numbers and all that jargon. It's going to be a fun time. So with that, let's get started. I've actually already sipped on this. I was cheating, but we'll pour a little bit more here. So golden color here, nice look to it. Smells good. It does not have that kind of like caramel and vanilla that I was getting with that Leffe, which actually was really smooth and flavorful. So let's see how it goes. Yeah, it's very nice, very easy drinking, as I like to say. Pretty smooth. It doesn't have the flavor of maybe that Leffe that I tried the last time around. Um, it's a little bit more dry. I would say like definitely, it's a Belgian ale. It's very smooth, but it's maybe like more dry, similar to like a lager, in my opinion. But still very nice. So if you're open to kind of a Belgian beer, this again is the New Belgium uh, Belgian style ale. It's their triple. Uh, Maybe if I say that enough, they'll like sponsor me for this. So, uh, but again, on the Byte side of the house, we are going to talk about the SEC rules changes. So why are we talking about SEC rules changes? Well, on the one hand, I think it's fascinating. And on the other, like I said, I've had some recent conversations that I think really sparked more of an interest. Um, I was doing an incident response tabletop exercise the other day, and it was an executive exercise. And so we were talking about potentially the filings that might be required, and obviously the SEC rules changes came up. So if you're not familiar with the SEC rules changes, at least what I'm going to be talking about is both the 8K and the 10K filing changes. Specifically, the new 8K rule requires that organizations who are in scope that they file their 8K disclosure of a material cybersecurity incident within 4 days of making the determination that the incident was material. So two things that really kind of come to mind immediately for most people is, oh my gosh, like what is material? How do I make that determination? And they're absolutely correct. Like that's very challenging. And unfortunately, the SEC has not issued a ton of guidance on this, nor do we have, eons of case law about what material is. Um, you could say material, is a byproduct of the data that's compromised. Could be the amount of systems compromised. Heck, in some ways, it could be like the attack vector, right? That maybe indicates that you have poor cybersecurity hygiene. Whatever the case may be, it could be that the threat actor wasn't a 13-year-old script kiddie, but was a nation state, and you're now being targeted and whatever, right? I think you're getting the fact that there are lots of things that go into the discussion of materiality, and it hasn't been really settled yet, right? So my recommendation on that front is for organizations to actually bake into their incident response plans some swim lane that says, hey, we will discuss whether this security incident is material, and we will use you know, these types of, examples for making that determination, things that I just referenced, right? But if you document that, right, at the very least, you'll have a mechanism to kind of go back and say, hey, we defined this, and we discussed this, and hey, SEC, you didn't tell us what material was, so we were left on our own to make that decision. And so go back and define that. Have a tabletop exercise and kind of walk through it. Gamify that and have the chat with the CEO. All of those types of things, right? I think it's very important. So that's what I think about the 8K, at least in terms of materiality. It's kind of like maybe you know it when you see it, but you should try to at least set up a process in advance. Now, what else are we talking about when it comes to the 8K rules change? Well, it's that timeline, right? It's the 4 days. And everybody gets hung up on this 4 days. And frankly, I don't really know why. I mean, I do know why. It's 4 days. Anytime you say a number, people are like, oh my gosh, 4 days from now, it's, Thursday, right? And we have these things, right? But what we sometimes don't realize is that, well, when does the clock start? It's not 4 days from now. It's not 4 days from when the threat actor was in there. It's 4 days from when you identified that the incident was material. And so you need to make sure that you understand that distinction. So talk to your counsel, talk to your executive team, figure out what the process is to evaluate that, and then follow that process, right? So at the end of the day, don't get hung up on the 4 days. PCI has had a 72-hour clock since the beginning of time. Equifax had a 24-hour notification window. Everybody has these windows, and at the end of the day, they sound very aggressive, and I suppose in some cases they might be, but for the most part, it's really a matter of when that clock starts, right? And the clock doesn't start right away. If you're familiar with cybersecurity or you've been involved in various incidents, you understand that the vast majority of the time the security team is looking at what data was compromised for days, right? They don't necessarily know. They're worried about containment. They're worried about eradication. It's after it's eradicated that you can start to think about what all was compromised, right? You're putting out the fire before you look at all the trees that were burned down, right? So the clock doesn't start right away. So we have to think about that. So again, don't be so afraid of the time frame. Just have the conversations in advance. Now, the other SEC rules change that I think is interesting is the 10K filing. So we've had 10K filings forever. You can go back and look at any public company. You can look at their 10K. You can read all the not so interesting stuff about them. It's not exactly edge of your seat reading, but now we have the 10K requirement where organizations will need to disclose their cybersecurity risk management practices. Now they have to do a couple of things. They have to say how they identify cybersecurity risk and how they manage that risk. And then on the other hand, they have to also say how they integrate that risk management with their broader enterprise risk management capability. So where does this come from, right? To some extent, we can blame SolarWinds for this. I think it's easy to blame them. That's probably not fair. We've had cybersecurity issues for many, many years. But I think when we look at SolarWinds, it's a great example of what the SEC was trying to prevent here with the SEC rules change, especially the 10K filing change. When you look at SolarWinds, I think it's interesting from a legal perspective because we have this kind of reasonable, prudent person standard when we think about the law, right? What would a reasonable, prudent person do? And we say, well, if you don't act like a reasonable, prudent person, then we can hold you liable in various scenarios. And I think, we have that same kind of standard, if you will, in cybersecurity, right? We can hold a company liable if they, maybe aren't acting like a reasonable, prudent, citizen within the cybersecurity space. But what's interesting about that is SolarWinds went out and said, well, hey, we've got a great cybersecurity program. And they started to, over time, kind of raise the bar, right? They said, we're more than reasonable, right? We're up here. We do all these great things. And then it turns out they didn't actually do all those great things. And that led to a lot of, obviously downstream impact to a lot of organizations. And so the SEC is saying, look, like, instead of going out and telling all the industry, telling everyone at industry events, about your cybersecurity program, disclose it within the 10K so that all the world, all the investors can have a normalized way of looking at your cybersecurity program, about your risk management capabilities, and hopefully we can avoid that. And so that's really what they're trying to do. So organizations need to go ahead and disclose their cybersecurity risk management practices. And my commentary there really is that organizations need to be very careful, right? They need to be cognizant of, obviously finding the balance between saying, look, I want to be specific about our security program, but I also don't want to be over committing, right, or over promising, and then under delivering. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, for organizations because, frankly, I think there's not a lot of open dialogue that happens in organizations. You have CISOs who have so much pressure, you have CTOs and CIOs who have so much pressure to keep the lights on all the time that they kind of say, yeah, everything's fine. Meanwhile, you look behind the curtain and you see that, well, the house might be on fire. If it's not on fire, there are children running around with fireworks. It's not necessarily safe, right? So there's not that open dialogue. It's not really a safe place in most organizations to say that, hey, things aren't working as well as I'd like them to. And we need to kind of put on our big kid pants and have those tough conversations with the executive team, with the boards of directors, and be very open and honest with kind of how things are, what our cybersecurity practices are, what our objectives are, and all of those things, right? So I'm hopeful that this will hopefully over time, kind of change that discourse, change the nature of the discussion internally, and really help open up those lines of communication. The other thing that I think is important is that the rule says, well, how do you integrate your IT risk management with your broader risk management capabilities? And I think that's very important because in every organization that I've worked in, save one, and by work in, I mean also consulted with, most organizations have, kind of two camps. They have an IT security camp that handles IT risk management, and they have an enterprise risk management camp that does all the other stuff. And, they've got their own practices, sometimes even their own cadence, sometimes their own audience, but they almost very rarely, anyway, use similar scoring methods. They very rarely aggregate their findings and whatnot to tell a singular story. So what that leaves the executive teams and the boards of directors to do is, basically read two stories and then compare them, which is incredibly challenging. And if you look at SolarWinds and that issue, the reason why the company and the CISO are being named in this fraud case is because they didn't do an adequate job of educating the executive team and the board of directors on what the risk was. And, I think part of that is they didn't, speak the same language, right? I may not agree that they didn't do a good job of communicating the risk, but regardless, that's the world we live in, right? We need to do a better job of communicating the risk. And part of that is making sure that when we tell a risk story to the board of directors, we're saying one story, not two stories, with two different characters and two different settings and vastly different plots, right? We need to make sure that when we communicate risk, we communicate all the risk, and that we can help the organization prioritize their risk and their remediation effort. And so I'm very hopeful that this 10K change will help IT risk management really kind of consolidate with the broader enterprise risk management teams, potentially even changing the way that those teams are structured, who they report into, I'm kind of on record as saying I think that these teams ought to probably report into legal. That is kind of like the protector of the organization. Legal typically already has very open dialogue about what the risk is and about what remediation should be. They have lines of communication open not only to the executive team but to the board of directors. So in my opinion, that's probably the best place for IT risk management to kind of report through. But regardless, we want to make sure that as we communicate risk upstream, that we are consolidating, that we're integrating the multiple areas of risk management so that executive teams and boards of directors can say, what is my risk? Not what is my IT risk, not what is my enterprise risk, or not what is my financial risk, not what is my credit risk. They can look at all of the risk in a normalized manner and make sound business decisions. At the end of the day, they only have so many resources to allocate to risk mitigation. If they have to split that then between two different paths of risk, right, it's made very complicated. And so we want to streamline that. We want to consolidate that, and I'm hopeful that that's kind of what we're going to start seeing. I think it's a challenging journey, but it's a very worthwhile journey to go and integrate those two paths. So anyway, would love to hear kind of what you're seeing in the market, what you're seeing your clients do if you're on the consulting side or the legal side, and if you're in-house and you're doing this, what are you doing to address the 8K and 10K changes? You know, I'd love to continue that conversation in the chat, via email, all of those things. So in the meantime, enjoy a beer, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.